All right, guys, welcome to Weightlifting Life. I'm Greg Everett, and with me, of course, is Coach Professor Mrs. Ursula Garza. Make sure to submit your questions to us at catalystathletics.com/podcast. And although the first episode sure doesn't make it seem like it, we will actually be answering questions. This is going to be episode 2, also known as the second episode. Although we recorded it out of order, so we're kind of stretching the fabric of space-time right now, but I think it's all going to work out in the end. Just a real quick current events, and this is coming out on Tuesday, and there was just some news out on IWF.net. I just saw it about 5 minutes ago. Ursula, you want to serve that up to the good folks?
Well, I don't have it in front of me, but it's short and sweet. The Russians are out. No, the Russians are out. So the IWF has, the for weightlifting. They left it up to the IFs, really. The IOC did what they're going to do with these teams, and we already saw that they had removed, and of course this created some controversy. They removed the lifters that had previously tested positive first. So there are a couple of women, and then now they've decided to remove the remainder of the team. So, the ones that had previously tested positive had already served their sanction, but they were still being removed, which, people kind of look at that and think, well, now that they've removed the whole team, it doesn't fucking matter. There you go. Done. Yeah. Now you have anything to say.
So
the whole team's out.
It's, we have a couple of our lifters who, of course, are behind on the starting list, behind some Russians, so that's going to automatically move.
Yeah, I think all of them, actually. We had a list. I had a list. It's actually going to be on the next podcast where we kind of gave a run through. And, depending on what they're doing with all of the specific countries that were involved. I think it was Kazakhstan was one of them as well, and I think Belarus. And so when we looked at those, the start lists, you note that there are, all of our lifters have Russians in front of them. So that would, directly impact. And of course, we don't know from that start list because it has alternates as well, like who's actually lifting.
Right.
So we won't know that till August 4th, I think, is maybe verification of entries. And so we'll see, the real deal.
Yeah, well, in any case, it's going to bode well for U.S. lifters and lifters from other countries who have more stringent internal drug testing. So,
and they've reallocated those spots to teams that generally come in behind us. So, they took essentially that removes someone from in front of us, and even if it places someone else in the class, when they give the quota to another country, and the IWF website and article gives you, who all got, I think Malaysia got a spot, some of the other countries that ended up picking up slots that were originally the Russian quotas are, for the most part, ranked behind us. So
perfect.
That does bode well for us. It pops us up a spot everywhere.
So to speak.
Yeah. No pun intended.
Oh, man, you're funnier than you even knew. All right, enough of this Olympic drug testing horseshit. Let's talk some questions, since we told everyone that was the entire premise of this show, and so far we have not delivered on it.
That's what you said. I said people should just hear us converse, that it's funny.
That's true, but we're not going to do your idea. No one likes you. Just kidding. Everybody likes you, and now more people will like you. All right. So Matt asks, is anybody able to adapt to different lifting techniques? Examples given: Russian, Chinese, etc. Or is there something biological or body shape, composition, whatever, that makes it easier for certain individuals to adhere to certain lifting techniques, and that technique to be the most efficient for them? You want to jump in on this one, or you want me to
we have to have some, I think, basic agreement about what is Russian technique, what is Chinese technique.
That was the first point I was going to address. I said that was the first point I was going to address too.
So we're basically talking about how long staying over the bar longer. Like the Russians are known for staying over the bar longer in the pool, like having more of a more obvious like hang position, where a lot of the Chinese have their shoulders in a little bit further back position, and get a little bit more friction on the thigh. So, and there's some peculiarities that we see with the Chinese in terms of body types and flexibility that lend this style, make this style more effective for them. But I mean, the second thing I think we have to do, and I don't know if you agree with that premise in terms of like the hang position.
Yeah.
But that's, kind of basically there's some other big differences in terms of the receiving position and the eventual bar path.
Yeah. But regarding the pull itself, I would just kind of add to that. You end up with Russian or most European lifters kind of having a little more hip involvement in that final pull. So staying over the bar longer and the shoulders possibly farther over the bar period during that pull. And the Chinese are a little more reliant on legs. So a little more upright posture, using more of a kind of a squatting motion and getting behind the bar.
So it's a quad dominant pull versus a kind of posterior chain dominant pull.
Right. And that ties perfectly into the what's the word I'm looking for? The stature, the anthropometrics of
that's what I wanted
those populations. And the Chinese population, weightlifting population, is pretty homogenous, unlike the U.S. population, which has a huge range of body types.
Right, and that's why I think you see a bit larger variety of potential effective techniques, where you have to kind of think the best technique for someone is the one that produces successful lifts consistently, routinely, and at higher percentages, right? Like all percentages, really varying low intensities. But like just looking at body types themselves, and you mentioned anthropometrics. The first time I talked about this in one of the courses I taught, one of the courses that I wrote, The Art of Coaching Weightlifting, I reference Laputin and Aleshko's article in Managing the Training of Weightlifters. And so that's one of the Russian training manuals that's been translated by Bud Charniga. And they talk about specifically dolichomorphs, mesomorphs, and brachiomorphs. And in the world of weightlifting, and so a dolichomorph is somebody with a shorter torso and longer limbs. A mesomorph is more proportionate, and a brachiomorph is like the little T-Rex people that have really long torsos and shorter limbs.
Generally you'd like to be one of those second two.
Right.
The
no
last
matter
two,
where you're from, that's usually, that lends itself just mechanically in terms of the lever system to being more effective.
Levers, is that like a lever?
Yes. Make fun of me. Did I say levers?
That's okay. You're allowed to.
Okay. So when we look at the different body types, like the brachiomorphs have these like wider hips, wider shoulders, long torsos, and short limbs. I mean, it's kind of easy. Like you can almost do no wrong with that body type, because if you just stand up, the bar's in your hip. Right. So, and you hang over the bar more easily because you've got that longer torso.
And you have way better mechanics with your legs. You have a far your levers are shorter, so it's easier to open the knee and open the hip under load relative to someone with a longer femur, for example.
And so, weightlifters basically tend to be mesomorphs or brachiomorphs. Like a dolichomorph is just, it's going to be difficult.
You're gonna have a rough time.
Yeah, and so somebody who's a dolichomorph, they generally have to start with a higher hip because they have long legs. You have to teach them how to stay over the bar, because getting over the bar is really difficult because they have the short torso. And so to produce any posterior chain action, you're going to have to they're going to have to kind of open their knee as they're standing, which then decelerates the bar in the transition passing the knee. So there are some, biomechanical inefficiencies that are basically created by having that particular body type. It's not to say that somebody with that body type can't be successful. It means that they have, biomechanical, impairments. So if we're looking at these different body types, that might dictate to some degree other things that would dictate potentially what type of pull style you're going to teach them. And so we see a bunch of brachiomorphs usually for Chinese lifters, and in the Russian lifters or the European lifters, I think you see more of a combination of some brachiomorphs and a lot of mesomorphs. And then in the U.S. population, you can get all of them because, like you said, it's a heterogeneous society. And so we don't have like just one influence. And it's not to say that if you have somebody who's Asian, then they should do some sort of, quote unquote Asian style pull. But basically you're looking at their body types, not where they're from.
Right. Your dog disagrees.
He agrees wholeheartedly. That's what he's doing.
Yeah, and I think so. Said perfectly is the issue is determining the lift style that best suits each individual based on a number of different elements. One of them being your structure. That's something you can't change. You can't make your bones shorter or longer, or change the relative proportions and all that kind of thing. So you've got someone with shorter legs, longer torso. You're going to typically do better with a more upright pulling posture, getting the knees under the bar sooner. So
and you're still over the bar. That's the great part about it. Like you can dig your knee under the bar and you still have your shoulders in front of the bar.
Right. So you're going to be able to use that leg extension to a greater degree to elevate and accelerate the bar relative to hip extension. Or you have someone who's more mesomorphic or even longer legged, you're going to have to kind of stay over the bar a little longer, potentially more, and you won't get that same leg drive. You're still going to get leg drive, but the relative contributions of legs and hips is going to be a little more skewed toward the hip side of things. And so you'll see a later and a less pronounced scoop than you would with the brachiomorphic lifter, the more kind of quote unquote Chinese style.
I think that's why the kind of the Russian style of pull or Polish style or European style, whatever you want to call it, is probably the more dominant method of teaching just basic beginners here in the U.S. because we see this range of body types. And so teaching like a specific technique that is oriented towards specific anthropometrics would, not really apply to the majority of the people.
Well, and I think that's a huge mistake that is made by new coaches or new athletes. And that is to say, wow, the Chinese are really good at weightlifting, so I'm going to lift like a Chinese person. Or the Russians are really good, so I'm going to lift like a Russian. Totally discounting who they are, what they need, or what their athlete needs. And the bottom line is that both styles, or all the different styles, share a core of principles that are never violated. And that's the issue people forget is, it's a completely different style of lifting. No, it's not. You're talking about the details of the basic principles. I wrote an article years ago. It was like 6 truths of Olympic weightlifting technique or something like that. And, it's all, balance over the foot, bar body proximity, this and that. Just, basic things that are never violated in a well-executed lift. But you see them expressed slightly differently based on proportions, based on even, the precise manner in which a lifter learned. But in addition to, your structure, you have other elements, just basic stuff like how fast twitchy someone is, how explosive they are versus how strong they are. Things like that are going to contribute to what actually works best. But what I would say, we
talked about that in the clinic that I helped you with. That was one of your Catalyst courses, and we talked about like how much the knee is bent at the hip, and how that is directly related. I mean, it's about impulse. So if you're slow twitch, then you might need to apply force over a longer period of time. You're going to have a little bit more bend in your knee than if you're a faster twitch athlete. And you see that manifest also in the type of extension that's done, where you can have this kind of Bulgarian full layback that applies force for a longer period of time versus, and with more of the hip, than one of those really straight. I tend to pull in a really straight Russian style pull. But the one thing that we see in common with all of them is that they're all variants of that Garheimer's S curve. Right. So, and when you talk about basic principles, that's one of them, right? And we have literature on, 4 essentially well-known and documented variations of the S curve, and some of them land the bar a little bit in front, which would require a little bit more mobility because you're not actually getting the final top curve at the end, that loop that brings the bar back over the ankle. So you need to have more mobility, and we see that with the Chinese. Like you have to have extraordinary ankle mobility to get your quad down almost parallel to the ground to be able to catch the bar slightly in front.
Right. Well,
and you see some little hops in front or things like that are just variants, but they're still executing the lift in this, some acceptable version of the S curve. And then, there's some good literature from Iranians about the optimization of the barbell trajectory. I don't know if you're familiar with it. It's from American Journal of Applied Sciences that talks about, that the ideal S curve would be kind of a flatter S curve, but that we're not built necessarily with the ideal mechanics. And so then we end up with these variants.
Right. And I actually go into great detail on that S curve and bar path and why it's taking place in the new edition I book. I talked about in the previous edition, actually all the editions, but I got much more in detail because there's kind of this new thing on the interwebs where this idea of the straight pull, and it gets really confusing because there are people, well, there's like two people who say like you need to pull the bar vertically in a straight line because that's efficient. And I've made this point for years because this one drives me bananas. You can't. That would be a model of efficiency with just a bar floating in space with no human body attached to it. But that's not what we have. We have a combined system where we have to keep the combined center of mass balanced over a specific base. And we need to move the two and interact with each other in a way that optimizes the mechanics of the thing that's lifting the bar. Mm-hmm. So in order for that to happen, the bar is going to move back slightly towards the lifter. It's going to move away slightly and then move back into position. Now, the degree to which it does that changes a little bit, but they all follow that same basic pattern. And then a point I made too with that is...
Well, if it's efficient. Because the bar moving away is just basically inefficient. It doesn't mean that you can't get away with it.
Well, but I'm not saying the bar is moving away like out of a good position, but you have to understand that when, the body and the bar basically come together around the hip level, right? They come together, they meet, but then they have to move, the bar has to move slightly forward, the body has to move slightly back so they can pass each other as the lifter's moving under the bar. But that movement isn't, you're not moving them out of balance or out of position. That movement keeps that system in balance over that same base. And I think people lose track of that. They're like, oh, well, that bar shouldn't move away. Well, no, it has to.
They get confused with like line of force.
Right. Well, there's lots of lines and centers and pressures and masses and what have you, gravities. But the other point I made with that is the heavier the bar is relative to the lifter, the less displacement of the bar you're going to have and the more displacement of the lifter you're going to have relative to each other. So if you have 50 kilos on a bar lifted by a 105 kilo guy and he's snatching it, that bar is going to go out a little bit more forward and the lifter's not going to go back. But if you have a little Chinese guy who's 62 kilos snatching 400 kilos like they apparently all do now, that bar path is going to look relatively straight. But it still moves, and you can see that. We have the technology. We can see it. You don't have to speculate and argue about it. It's right there. So I think that needs to be kept in mind.
That you're talking about, and that's that's talked about from the this literature that we have from like the 70s and 80s. They talk about with the lighter weights, the kind of looser S curve that tightens up with heavier weights.
Right.
And so with elite lifters, right? I mean, with newer lifters, you kind of try to keep them moving technically well, but it ends up putting the bar at a higher point if you don't loosen that bar path. And so people who are catching the bar at the same height and they're adjusting the force as opposed to adjusting the height that they pull the bar will just loosen the path with the lighter weights, and then they tighten it up as it gets heavier so that the bar continues to go to the same height. But it's hard with the beginner because they don't know how to adjust force to teach them all that. That's why very often they end up really doing a power snatch into a full snatch, and you've got to kind of eventually pull them in to where they can have the kinesthetics to control how hard they jump and how much force they apply to the bar, and keep the bar moving, in close proximity to their body all the time.
Yes. So I think we got a little far afield on that one, but
I don't think so.
But no, it's all
we didn't talk about was like how an individual's particular strengths may have some effect on what technique they originally adopt. And it may be that you adjust it. Like, so let's say you have somebody who deadlifts a shitload and they don't squat very much. Then they tend to do something that is more posterior chain dominant, and that might affect exactly how they pull. Like they're not going to necessarily sit very low in the start position and use the legs a lot. I mean, now I would say you always want to get them stronger in their legs if that's the case, right? Because there's something to be gained from that. But sometimes the initial technique taught is somewhat affected by the strengths and the mobilities and immobilities of the lifter. Yeah. So you take somebody with an anterior position of the shoulder and like a wing scapula, and that bar off the hip just inherently moves further away from them. So now you've got to pull their chest and shoulders. And maybe I'm talking more about just bar path itself than I am different lifting techniques, but that's what the different lifting techniques really is.
Well, I think, though, it's important to distinguish, you just kind of alluded to it, between physical traits that are permanent and unchangeable and physical traits that are trainable.
Sure.
So if you have, the proportions, the structure of a lifter, that's never going to change unless it's a young lifter who's still growing. Then it may very well change dramatically in some cases. But in like you gave the posterior chain dominance thing, so you got a guy who just spends his whole life deadlifting, squats, box squats, or sits way back in a squat, leans way over, or something goofy like that. That's something that you can retrain to get that lifter better suited for a more optimal technique in lifting. That's going to be better for him regardless of proportions. We ready for the next question?
Yeah, I think we beat that one kind of to death. Maybe not. Probably didn't even answer the damn question. No one asked.
No, that horse is dead. Dead and gone. Dead and gone and insulted.
Thanks, Matt. Is that Foreman that asked that?
No, Matt Foreman would ask something totally inappropriate that we couldn't even.
Yeah, he would ask like, what was your best, like, wildest drunken episode that you can actually remember?
Yeah, exactly. But if the best one is the one you can't remember, so that's a stupid question.
Right.
All right. Anthony asks, for people coming to weightlifting after being introduced through CrossFit, the jerk seems like the movement that is most foreign. Lots of presses, push press, shoulder to overhead, etc. What drills or cues do you find work best for helping new lifters develop better jerk technique? Also, why do I suck at snatch balances? Well, this one, we get this all the time. Ursula, I'm sure you get this all the time too, but like on our Facebook and Twitter and things like that, we get that question. What's the best drill for making my jerk better? That's an impossible question.
What the fuck's wrong with your jerk? Let's figure that out first.
the best drill is going to be one that addresses your worst problem. So it's totally going to depend.
We're not making fun of Anthony, and I actually think he asked two questions in here, because he asked the question of, because there is something about, if you give me a new lifter that is not out of CrossFit and hasn't developed. So the one thing that we get from the lifters that come straight out of CrossFit into weightlifting is that they've done a ton of pressing overhead. So you take anybody who's done a ton of pressing overhead, and there might be a tendency to try to use their arms as opposed to transfer the force from their legs to the implement, which is the bar.
But the related problem too is that there are typically no standards for lockout with any overhead work. So not only do you have a lot of pressing work and that kind of over dominance of upper body strength relative to legs, but you have thousands and thousands of practice reps of pressing jerks out. So the timing is off, the split position is off.
And very often they don't even get the bar like over their center of mass. Like they leave the bar out in front because they're just like jacking it up there. It almost looks like an incline movement to me instead of a actual press. Like
it's a split incline bench.
Yeah.
Classic. That worked in the 60s when the clean and press was still a lift.
Right, when you
doesn't go over so well anymore.
And the weight is heavy.
But let's stipulate that is the situation where you have athletes who are very strong in the upper body overhead or pressing, potentially bound up mobility wise in the shoulder girdle, that sort of thing, don't necessarily have much upper back strength to support overhead, don't know the good overhead position like bar behind the neck.
So the orientation is off.
And then have poor timing with regard to both kind of the transition between leg drive and the push with the arms, and the transition between the leg drive and the movement into the split or feet into the power position.
Right, so they push up instead of going down.
Right.
So it's a press up instead of a pressing down into and letting the legs amortize.
Yes, amortization. We're either talking about weightlifting or finances.
Yes,
I never liked that word.
Not finances.
Huh?
I said not finances.
Yeah, if we're talking about weightlifting, we're definitely not talking about finances. Maybe the lack thereof. So with the lockout timing, that sort of thing, number one, you got to establish and train and practice a proper overhead position. That's number one. There's no point in learning how to get the bar somewhere if you don't know where that somewhere is.
Right.
So things like, press behind the neck or push press behind the neck, or even just, basic instruction. Practice this damn overhead position until you get it right. I don't have to yell at you and embarrass you in front of everybody.
Right. So you have to get the point of orientation, like where its final point of orientation firmly established, so that you go back to that same place every time, right, using the same path.
And so the way I usually describe that is that trunk's going to be inclined forward very slightly. We're not leaning way forward and getting crazy. And that head is pushed through the arm slightly, so the bar is over the base of the neck. A lot of people say, well, behind the ears, this and that, but that just depends on how you're holding your head. So I don't like that
right.
cue.
That's relative to your head position. Yeah. And I typically look over, like I look from the top of the, where the bar is, look at the wrist, and then look at the shoulder, and then drop it down to like over the side of the ankle, maybe a little bit in front of that, and see, is the bar aligned structurally? Like, is there structural support to support the weight? Because that's what you're going to need when you have really, really heavy weights.
Yeah. So if you have the bar over the base of your neck and you're not falling over, you're probably good.
So then that's where the bar goes. The other big problem, I think, that you see with CrossFit, well, and this happens with, when we're about to look at the snatch balance question or the drop snatch question or whatever it was next, overhead squat, is being comfortable in that split position and having a good split position, like knowing where your feet are going to go over and over. Because I see a whole lot of people like trying to get out of the split before they're even in it.
Yeah.
And so when the weight gets heavier, they're not even really opening the feet anymore. And so they don't use the same split position with heavy weights that they do with light weights, which is an indicator that they're not really comfortable with it yet. And so you need to develop the comfort. I like, so you have bar orientation, you have foot placement orientation. And I think, I think you call it a jerk balance. I don't know. I mean, we have some difference in terminology, but basically, dip drive with your feet in the split and catch it still in the split. I think the longer you can spend, the more time you spend in this actual split position, the better your comfort, strength, and orientation to that particular position becomes. So I have my athletes do pressing in the split position, push pressing in the split position, and then jerk balance, sometimes with a step, if they can do it right. If they don't drop their back knee when they step, then they don't get to do that. They have to learn how to catch over their hips with their legs. And then we move on to the jerk balance with the step.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what your different names for those exercises. I know we had a conversation at your Catalyst
I think the only
course.
one we differed on was jerk balance. You just called it a jerk balance with a step.
Uh-huh.
But
well, so sometimes
okay.
we do it the jerk balance like with the feet in the jerk position and you never move them. Like they just stay in the jerk position. You just go down, up, down, and catch.
Right. So I call that a push jerk in split.
That's so complicated.
It's not complicated at all. Hey, look at the English translations of every Russian exercise, and it's an entire paragraph.
It's picking the right exercise and executing it correctly.
Yes.
Because the name doesn't mean two shits.
No, it doesn't even mean one shit.
Yeah, it just matters of whether it actually applies to the problem that you're having. So like for somebody that if I make them do the jerk balance with the step that you're talking about and they push forward with their knee and their whole system tilts, then that shit's out. Like they got to go back to keeping their feet in place and learning how to catch, keeping the tibia perpendicular to the ground. If they're going to keep inclining it, then that drill isn't really effective in what I'm trying to elicit.
So wait, hang on. You're giving me shit about a complicated name, but you just said tibia perpendicular to the ground instead of shin vertical. So you're cut off. But with regard to the split position, I think it's important too to keep in mind that there are a couple components to that. Is number one, the familiarity and the comfort in that position. Like, do they actually know where the feet should go? That's number one. And that's something you have to teach them, and they have to drill. And you can drill that in a million different ways. They can just do, that transition from standing in that drive position, moving into the split position. It's as simple as it gets. You can do exercises like drop to split or jump to split or, the jerk balance, a number of different things like that. Jerk balance with step, as Ursula might say. But then there's the actual strength and stability issue. If you are not strong enough or stable enough to hold weight overhead in a relatively deep split position, your body's not going to put you in that position during a jerk. There's no way around it. Your body's not stupid. It doesn't want to get hurt.
We go to jerk recoveries.
Right. So you've got stuff like jerk recoveries. Yeah, you've got step to split, walk to split, just basic, any kind of lunge exercise, but in particular ones that are going to put you in the proper split position for a jerk. So you've got to learn the position and practice it. You've got to strengthen that position and be stable and strong, and so you're confident both consciously and unconsciously. And then you have to be able to incorporate that. But that third element, I think, though, has a lot to do with timing. So you can know exactly your split position. You can be strong in that split position and stable. But if your timing is off between the drive upward of the bar and that movement into the split, you're still going to be screwed and not get into a proper split. In other words, if you stop short on that drive and start trying to move your feet, or your movement during a jerk into the split is improper, like you're diving your head and chest forward so that your hips move backwards, your back foot flies up in the air, and your front foot hits right away, it doesn't matter how good you are in the split position in isolation, you're not going to get there. So you really do have to diagnose the source of the problem. What's that?
The former thing that you mentioned had to do with extension. And I actually make an analogy of that, in relative to like how someone extends in a pool, like knowing when the extension is enough and to go under.
Right.
It's the same thing in the top of a snatch and the top of a clean as it is in the thrust of the jerk. Like there's a moment at which the bar's in flight. It's not going to, you're no longer applying force, and it's time for you to, go inside. Determining that, which is different for different people because it depends on the speed of the bar, becomes really important in being able to have the right timing to catch that. And so that really comes with, you have to have all these other things in place to really practice that, because that basically comes with practicing the split jerk.
Right.
To develop the timing.
And there's, for those of you who love videos and get mad at me every time I post an article because it's not a video, that's what I get is, why is this article not a video? It's like, well, I mean, shit, I can't make a video of everything. But I did make a video regarding this very issue about jerk dip depth and speed. And that kind of goes back to the previous question, where what works best for you is individual based on your structure and your, fast twitch, slow twitch, explosiveness versus strength kind of thing. And so, Ursula kind of said this, is you basically want to transition from the drive to the split at the time when the bar kind of reaches its maximal upward speed. And that's where you're going to take over with the arms too. And so for someone who is really explosive and springy, they're going to have a shorter, quicker dip. And then basically they're going to start, that bar is going to reach its upward maximal speed sooner. So they won't stay with that upward drive quite as long before they split, versus someone who's a little bit more strength dependent. They're going to have somewhat deeper dip, a little bit slower transition, and they're going to have to drive upward longer to get that same ultimate upward speed before they can split. So knowing... So you've got... Don't interrupt me, dog.
I know, he's a Great Dane. You've got this 8 to 14% of your height is typically what is dictated as your dip depth. Well, that's a huge difference. 8% versus 14%. So and it relates to what you said in terms of the physiology. Yeah. Fast twitch versus slow twitch fiber, where a slow twitch fiber athlete is going to usually sit deeper and try to apply force longer. And then somebody who's like very athletic gets away with and I say very athletic because it means they're fast twitch, and that's what we're looking for, a shorter, quicker, more succinct dip, and then all of a sudden the bar's up there. We see them.
I hate those people.
Yeah, I do too.
Because I'm not one of them.
Yeah,
if I was one of them, I would think we were great.
It was always my nemesis. I figured everything out pretty quickly, but the jerk is elusive for some of us, and
I'm with you.
Yeah. And there's really so much variation in what, we say find a good split position. Well, that's all relative. Find a good dip depth. Well, that's all relative to, it's each athlete you have to examine and try to figure out what is most efficient for them.
Yeah.
So I actually have had some athletes that have switched from split jerk because they just had really long legs, and timing wise, even with the grip out wider, by the time their feet would land where they needed to be, the bar was already coming back down.
Yeah.
And so, I've had a couple of lifters that switched to power jerk because of that, or squat jerk of some sort, hybrid, but not the norm. I mean, the norm is that you spend a lifetime trying to perfect the split jerk because you almost always will lift more with the split jerk. It's rare to see people, and they're really usually super talented and have some strength, like abilities beyond the norm to be able to carry something like a power jerk or
nothing gets me angrier than watching Kakashvili power jerk. It's like the most effortless thing you've ever seen in your life. It drives me crazy.
Well, and you see it, like people look at Opti or they look at some of the other like Asian squat jerkers and they're like, I'm going to squat jerk. I'm like, you are not that guy.
You're not.
Do you know how strong that guy's back is to be able to do that?
Yeah.
It's insane. And legs. Like you have to almost be, I think, like over strong for the weight that you're lifting.
You do. You have to be able to clean grip overhead squat from a dead stop what you just cleaned. That's a small percentage of the population.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got the fundamental the underpinnings here, but so he asks what drills and cues. So drills, we already talked about jerk balance. I like what I call push jerk behind the neck and split, and of course you can get videos of these on our website if you have no idea what these are. And those two will both teach you proper balance in the split position, get you feel that position, get comfortable, get stronger in it, but then also train the timing and the aggression of the lockout in that proper overhead position. Power jerks or push jerks, I think, are really good for practicing the proper dip depth and the timing and the correct orientation of the bar, because that bar needs to go up and slightly back. It can't go straight up. It certainly can't go forward or you're going to die. And that's where you're going to get a ton of press outs where you don't get that proper bar orientation. Tall jerk. I love tall jerks, power or split, because that's focusing almost 100% on that actual lockout, that idea of punching yourself down under the bar rather than just continually trying to push the bar up, which is, I think, where a lot of the problems come into play. Any other ones you can think of?
Well, I mean, I said jerk recovery. That's, for like core stability and strength overhead. I mean, I think that's at the tail end. Like when you have all these other things in place, if there's still some deficiency, sometimes it's like just the core strength can't stabilize the heavy weight overhead. And so you want to specifically develop the balance and the strength of the core while you're carrying heavy weight overhead. And so, we'll go like 110 to 120% of whatever you can jerk. You should be able to do some sort of jerk recovery from. Most of my guys are like hard pressed to do 100 for doubles at this point. So it tells, one of the things you can do, I think one of the easy ways to figure out like where am I fucked up is go through all these drills that are on the Catalyst site and make sure you can execute them all. If you find the one that you're shitty at, then that's the one you need to work on. Like I have people tell me all the time, like, well, why do I have to go through all these? I can do the full lift if you put it together. Like I can do the snatch off the floor better than I can do a hang snatch. And I'm like, look, you have to fucking be able to do both.
Yeah.
Like if you can't do both, then there is a basic disconnect going on.
Well, and people forget too, is like, well, I can do the full snatch. Yeah, but you could do it better if we square away these other things.
Right. Like
let's settle down. You're not world class yet.
Every part should be good, and then the whole will be good.
Yeah.
But to say the whole's good and so that the parts don't matter, the parts are important too. You should be able to break any lift down and do it from any position. And the same, if you go through the variety of exercises that are on the Catalyst site and you practice all those drills, find the one that you suck at and then work on that one, because that's probably the one that is causing you the problems in your actual jerk. That's
a pretty good rule of thumb, is the stuff you like the least is the stuff you're worst at, and that's the stuff you need to work on. So
that's why as soon as I find out somebody doesn't like an exercise, they get it every week.
Yeah.
Like the worst thing you can do is tell me I hate this exercise, because you just wrote yourself a prescription, buddy.
Yep. All right, so his final question here, which we're not going to be able to really get into great detail, is why do I suck at snatch balances? And that's the same kind of can of worms, as there's a million different reasons you could suck at snatch balances. You might not even know what a snatch balance is. You might have terrible overhead mobility. You might have a fucked up ankle that doesn't flex enough, so you can't sit into a squat
I wrote
properly.
down 2 things just to put it in just to sum it up. You're either weak overhead or you're immobile. Like those are going to be the 2 things that create that lack of comfort.
But see, I have to politely and professionally disagree with the weak overhead part, because someone can be incredibly strong overhead, even in a snatch grip, and be terrible at snatch balances. Because a snatch push press or like a snatch recovery or even an overhead squat.
In the bottom position.
Well, okay, but even an overhead, you can have someone who's very strong overhead squat and they can't do dick in a snatch balance.
Well, then they're uncoordinated. You didn't let me get to the last one.
You said 2. You listed 2 already. You can't preface it with 2 and then list 2 and say you didn't let me get to the 3rd.
Yeah. No. But, okay, you're either immobile, weak, or uncoordinated.
You're either immobile, weak, or bad at snatch balances.
I can figure out the 4th one.
So it's a positioning and like a precision and a timing issue too, and that's why snatch balances are so valuable, because it's not just strength overhead, it's not just bottom position, it's the timing and the precision. Is you have to be able to put your body directly under the bar in the proper position, put the bar in the exact proper position overhead, which we talked about a second ago.
At the right time while you're sitting.
Exactly. Lock it out at the same time.
Continue moving.
Yeah. So it ties all those things together, and that's why generally you're going to see a transition over a lifter's career from more basic kind of stuff like overhead squats into more difficult things or more advanced things like snatch balance variations. Not to say that a more advanced lifter will never use overhead squats, but you'll see typically less of them relative to more complex stuff like snatch balances. So figure out what's holding you back and then fix that problem is the best I can say.
Well, when I teach snatch balance, I typically teach position by doing a high catch first and just learning how to meet the bar. And then, I check the actual overhead squat, and then we try to put them together. So, I think I've seen people that they just drop their bodies into a snatch balance. They just dive, and they drop their chest. The bar goes back. Their weight's on their heel. They're all pitched forward. And you're like, no. Just got to break it down and do little pieces of it.
Stop. That's gross.
Yeah, no, it's disgusting. You have to learn how to snatch balance, I think, just like all the rest of the just like you learn how to jerk. It's just another fucking thing to learn in weightlifting. But to become proficient at it, you have to actually do it, and you can't hate it. And if you hate it and you don't do it, you're never going to be good at it.
Oh no, you can hate it. I don't give a shit how you feel about it. You still have to do it. I tell my lifters all the time, I don't give a fuck about your feelings. You stuff them deep down inside and never let them out. But with regard to that, it's an important point to make. Is people say, well, how much should I snatch balance relative to my snatch? And ideally, I would like you to be able to snatch balance more than you can snatch, because that's really great for preparing you to receive heavier and heavier snatches, both physically and psychologically.
Well, as a coach, it gives you some confidence too. You're like, okay, this guy's never thrown this weight overhead, and let's see what's going to happen.
He won't. Is less of a chance that he or she is going to die. But what Ursula is saying is, to be proficient at something, you have to actually do it regularly. So if you never do snatch balances, don't expect to be able to snatch balance 10 to 15 kilos more than you can snatch. That's just silly. If you snatch balance once a week for the first 5 years you lift, you're probably going to be really good at snatch balancing. For the longest period of time, I could snatch more than I could overhead squat or snatch balance, by far. But it's because I never had a problem overhead, so I never did those exercises. So it's totally dependent on how much effort and time you put into those things relative to snatching. The
coordination that you develop with a snatch balance is really, really helpful in that turnover in the snatch itself.
Well, and not even just the overhead part, but the movement of the feet, the movement of the legs to pull under, so you're not getting the weird drop foot sliding backward, weird, just hanging dead legs. I hope I kind of end up in a pile that's strong enough under this bar to support it, sort of pull. You know what I'm talking about.
A dive?
I hate anything that involves dropping or falling under a bar.
Right,
I don't even like the concept of catching a bar.
Like that disconnect.
Yeah. You don't catch a snatch or a clean because
for a minute, and then you're hoping that they're going to reconnect, and then when they do, one of them is stable enough to hold it, which would be the person.
If you're catching a lift, that means you threw it or someone threw it at you. So don't do that. You receive a lift. Mike Bergner drilled that into our heads day one, pretty much. It's not catching.
Yeah, it's like not a throw and catch, guys.
Yeah. All right. So I think we got time for one more quick question here before people get completely sick of us. And that would be one from Drew. Huh?
Okay. No, I was looking at the last one because the last one we talked about you were going to answer on your own. But yeah, go ahead. Do Drew.
What are you talking about the last one?
Tommy.
Oh. Yeah, no, let's save that for the next one because that'll take too long.
Okay.
Drew asks, what is the best way to implement overhead squats into a program, particularly a program that already has back squats and front squats during the week with high volume and high intensity days? So we kind of talked about this before, but number one is if you're thinking about putting overhead squats in your program, it doesn't matter if you're already doing front squats and back squats. They're basically unrelated. The overhead squat shouldn't be considered a squat in the sense of that kind of burdening in your program. It's not going to have anywhere near the same effect. Think of it as an overhead strength lift. Yeah, so it'd be like saying, I don't want to bench press because I'm already squatting.
I relate them to the snatch. Like to me, these are snatch related exercises. They're not really squat. I mean, they are. I mean, they have a squat, but the snatch has a squat in it. Right. You didn't ask about the snatch. The clean has a squat in it. You didn't ask about the clean.
Right.
Everything has a squat in it in weightlifting.
So the basics of how I would implement that, how I would incorporate that into a program is the simple way is to do them on the same day you're snatching because you're kind of collecting similar movements, and that's good for motor learning, but it's also good for preventing kind of I'm hurting for words today. I don't know what's going on. There's nothing wrong with me that I know of. I don't have a tumor.
I want to check.
Yeah, I should probably check. But you're not going to end up wearing yourself out overhead, the day before you're supposed to do something crazy overhead, like snatch really heavy, for example.
Were you looking for the word fatigue?
No, that's definitely not it. I know that
Could have been.
But in any case, that's one way to do it. The other way to do it would be to have make sure you have a day that's kind of emphasizing overhead strength that doesn't fall before a day where you're going to have to do an overhead Olympic lift, so a snatch or a jerk. That's going to be really high intensity or heavy weights that you really have to be not fatigued for. There, you can use it now, Ursula. So in other words, you don't want to go crazy and do 1,000 overhead squats and snatch push press and stuff like that, and then try a max snatch the next day because you're probably going to feel like shit and drop a bar on your head. Pay attention to the intensity for the next day
and work into the how long it's going to take to recover from that, and whether it's going to be beneficial or detrimental to the next day's work.
Yeah. And of course, that doesn't mean you can't do overhead lifts 2 days in a row. Of course you can.
Right, we do them every day.
You're talking about the degrees of volume and intensity and how they're going to affect subsequent workouts. So generally, I think the overhead squats, you can use them a number of different ways. You can use it as a standalone exercise. So you're going to do, 5 triples in the overhead squat on Tuesday, whatever. That's going to be a relatively heavy exercise. You can use it as kind of a warm-up lift or a primer. So let's say you have a poor overhead position, you're unstable, you're uncertain. You do a few sets of really light overhead squats before you start your snatches that day. And so that's a non-fatiguing, more technique, mobility, stability exercise in that case, where maybe you do 5 sets of 3 or you do 3 sets of 5, but it's like empty bar to 30-40% or something like that. So it's not going to wear you out for the subsequent snatches. It should actually loosen you up and make you feel better. And then, of course, you can do those lighter, sort of more technique and mobility-oriented overhead squats throughout a given training week because they're not going to really affect a whole lot. You can do them at the end of a session, the beginning of a session, the middle of a session. Doesn't really make much difference. So the only thing you really have to be concerned about timing-wise is when you're doing, heavy and or higher volume overhead squats and how that's going to affect a subsequent workout.
I almost always use them in combination with something. We rarely just try to do an overhead. I mean, we do a lot of power snatch plus overhead squats or snatch and then add a couple of 1 or 2 overhead squats at the end, just because it puts you under that load longer without fatiguing the pool necessarily, or snatch balance plus overhead squat. So I almost always use them in some combination.
Yeah.
But we don't ever prescribe them. I don't. And I know a lot of coaches do. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. It's just that's what I do.
Yeah. Well, and whether or not you prescribe them individually is going to depend on the need of the athlete, obviously. Right. But yeah, doing them in a complex with a snatch or a power snatch or something like that is really nice. Or we'll do them in complex with like snatch push press plus overhead squat, or I'll do some kind of snatch balance variation plus overhead squat. The nice thing about doing overhead squats after a snatch is that a lot of you assholes like to snatch and drop the bar, standing halfway up each time, and then wonder why on your tough snatch attempts you can't hold the damn bar overhead. So that forces people to recover completely from the snatch, stabilize the bar, and then do it again without having to say, don't drop the bar until you're standing up every single time.
And it just shows some core control and the further development without having to add an extra pull into it.
Plus, they hate doing it, so that just makes me happy.
Yeah, that makes you want to give it to them all the time.
Right. All right. Well, I feel like we did an adequate job on this episode.
I might have like a C+.
It's a passing grade. We're not Dean's listing or anything, but it'll do.
Not yet. You just wait, people. You just wait.
Yeah, you just wait.
We're just getting our bearings.
I don't know what you're waiting for, but wait
I don't
for
either.
something.
It's like next episode, we're going to literally answer one question.
Yeah, but it's done really well. All right, guys.
Like the other ones.
We're getting out of here. We got weightlifting stuff to do.
I gotta get Lulu.
Oh God. Make sure you send us more questions. CatalystAthletics.com/podcast. Also, this thing is now on iTunes, Google Play, and Stitcher, so you can go subscribe to whichever one of those things you enjoy most for your listening pleasure. Of course, you can listen to it directly on the website with the embedded player, or you can download the MP3. Do all kinds of cool stuff with it. And we will talk to you next time.
Oh, and I created some gang signs, Greg, if you'll let me teach everyone.
No, absolutely not. I will not encourage that kind of delinquent behavior.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
All right. See ya.
See ya.